Oh my goodness, Beth and Jeff, it's so great to have you guys on the Nothing is Wasted podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Hey, thanks for inviting us. We really appreciate it.
I don't think you understand. I remember I was in an airport and I came across the Enneagram coach for the first time. Right? And it was somewhere back early in my grief journey. And I was just enamored with everything that you guys were doing. And I'm like, man, so I started following. And I've been wanting to have this conversation for years.
Wow.
Years. So no pressure whatsoever.
No pressure,
No, man, I'm not sure who we are in your mind, but I hope you're okay with who we actually are.
Oh, man. No, even just a little bit of time we've gotten to talk before we hit record. It's just such a sweet spirit coming from you guys. I think I'm really interested in this because I love what you guys do. I love how it's helped me on my own journey, not just in grief, but also just in discipleship and sanctification. And so why don't you do this? Why don't you tell us a little bit about, just kind of give us a flyover, who you are, what you guys do, just in case any of our listeners aren't familiar with you.
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so we're Beth and Jeff McCord. We live outside of Nashville, Tennessee. We've got 2 grown kids now. But basically what we do is we walk people through a gospel-centered approach to the Enneagram, helping them to discover who they really are at a core level and why they do what they do. And the reason we do it from a gospel-centered perspective is because we want them to realize you do struggle with shame, guilt, fear, self-condemnation. But the gospel helps us to move from that mindset to the mindset that we are unconditionally loved, free, and forgiven through Christ. And so we want to learn how to navigate between those two worlds. And one way that we can do that, there's lots of ways, right, that we can do that. One way we can do that is understanding why we do what we do based off our main personality type. And as we'll get into how our new book shows, that we have a lot of different types that are influencing us. But the biggest thing is, how do we show up in life, whether it's from an unhealthy part of our heart or a healthier part of our heart? And so what we're really doing is coaching, discipling, mentoring, whatever you want to call it, people in their journey and their walk to a richer, more meaningful life with Christ.
Wow.
And I mean, on a very personal note, we learned about the Enneagram in 2001. Beth and I had been married for 3 years.
No, it's 6 years.
6 years? Okay, 6 years. We had two
little kiddos.
One infant, one toddler.
1-year-old, 3-year-old.
Libby.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when a mentor of ours who had been in counseling, they had a child die at birth. And their therapist recommended Richard Rohr's book on the Enneagram.
Yeah.
And I was at a conservative Presbyterian seminary, and so Richard Rohr wasn't prescribed writing for that school.
Yeah, I imagine.
So
Probably still not.
we kept it quiet, but Beth really dove into it. And so we have never we eventually did, but at that time we never set out to become Enneagram coaches and influencers.
No, not even
it
for
was
a long
the
time.
Overflow of our individual lives, our marriage, and how we parented.
Yeah.
Then started to bear fruit in mentoring couples and mentoring individuals. And so then it just kind of, and then whenever things really started to pick up for the Enneagram, it took off for us. So we're really stewarding a gift, a calling that the Lord's given us. And
I think to go back to the original part of when we found the Enneagram, we got married when we were 20. So
yes.
we grew up together basically.
I mean, our kids are young. Our daughter's married now, but they ask, I mean, like our son was thinking about getting married at 20. I'm like, how dare you?
Yeah.
Who do you think you are?
It seems different when it's your kids, doesn't it? When you look back.
Oh, totally different. Yeah.
I was totally mature.
Right.
Yeah.
We thought we were.
Man, that was such a grimace on your face.
Because I knew we both aren't. But yeah, so we got married when we were 20, and we're best friends, love doing life together, and we're still best friends and love doing life together. But there was turbulence, and we couldn't figure out why and where it's coming from. And we're still on that journey because we're still unpacking our story. And I've learned in the last year or so a lot of different kind of little traumas that I had growing up that have affected me. So that plays into our story. But when we learned about the Enneagram, I, as a type 9, did not know myself well at all, that we had this internal fog. And so it's really hard to grow in a relationship when your spouse is wanting to get to know you better and understand what these dynamics are, and you can't even explain, you don't even know. And so the Enneagram basically started to wipe away the internal fog and make things more clear. Now, as a 9, there's still internal fog all the time. That's a daily thing. But it gave vocabulary for us to understand one another, help Jeff to know how to navigate this relationship with this type 9 and vice versa, me with the type 6, in a way that's more compassionate and empathetic and understanding. But I think the biggest thing that I'd like to say to those who are listening, I don't know what others are thinking about different people on different platforms. They kind of look up to them and esteem them, like, look, they've made it, they've arrived. Please just realize Jeff and I are still doing the work today.
We're like the president for Hair Club for Men.
I'm also
not only am I a president, I'm also a client.
Yeah.
I love it.
So everything we do at YEC comes out of our own work that we have been doing and are continuing doing.
Just started a discussion for our next book, and I mean, there are some great topics out there, but it's not in line with.
Yeah, I mean, you could talk about the Enneagram with anything.
Yeah, right.
But we want it to come from a place that we've utilized it, and we can guide people through that same journey and same path.
Love that.
So that's just a little bit of background.
That's the most genuine approach, right? I mean, at the end of the day, really, I speak at it from like a ministry perspective. I know you guys do too, right? Where, in terms of the outward facing you shouldn't, although you see it happen a lot in ministry, the outward facing you should not be, incongruent with the inward, what's going on behind closed doors you. And so for you guys just say, hey, here's what we're just wrestling. We're fellow strugglers in this. We're kind of a guide just a few steps ahead of you guys. And so don't take this as us preaching at you. Yeah.
And I think that is an issue with the church as a whole, but I would definitely say the American culture is that, if you're a Christian, you're a leader, you need to look a certain way, or you need to have arrived at a certain level, and there should be no more faults. But what we really want to show is, you know what? We're in this with you. We struggle, and here's what we've learned. Here's what God's doing in our life, and just to be, fellow journeys, in this process with people.
Right. Jeff, it's funny you brought up this interesting point. You're at this conservative Presbyterian seminary, and Richard Rohr was not on the reading list by any means. And you see that in evangelical Christianity and beyond, right? You see that there are different circles in evangelical Christianity that really are accepting, not even more than, they're evangelistic about the Enneagram, right? Like, you start talking about some circles and it's like, whoa, this, and everybody gets excited about it, and it becomes kind of these party conversations and stuff, and you're typing each other and you're telling each other, what your type is and all this stuff. But then you have other sectors of evangelical Christianity that are very cynical about it, right? And John Calvin even said in his introduction to Institutes, he said that without self-awareness, there's no awareness of God, right? There's no true awareness or self-knowledge. There's no true knowledge of God, I think is how he actually put it. And so we see that it's important. You guys are obviously entrenched in it's important, but what would you say to maybe the believer who's listening to this right now and be like, I've kind of been really kept that at bay because it feels hokey, it feels new agey, it feels,
Sure.
Well, I think early on, whenever we were learning about the Enneagram and Beth was reading more, it's kind of funny. Aside from Rohr's book, which was titled A Christian Perspective on the Enneagram, all the other authors taught from their worldview. So you might have Rohr, Catholic mystic, and then you had some secular psychologists, more Freudian types with Rizzo and Hudson. And so everybody was teaching from their worldview, even Claudio Naranjo and how he formulated these 9 types, and plus his academic career, including his spirituality. It was all mixed in, but each person that encountered the Enneagram was teaching from their worldview. Well, when Beth and I were studying early on, there weren't other Jeff and Beth McCords out there. So we're over in the New Age section Borders bookstore or
Right.
Barnes and Noble trying to find an Enneagram book. And Beth's like, well, we certainly don't agree with this,
Right.
but the principles and descriptions seem true.
Yeah.
What categories are there in the Bible that speak to this, and how does the Bible speak differently about those categories? So the idea of true self and false self versus being made in the image of God and being renewed in the image of God when we have a relationship with Jesus, those kinds of categories.
Put to death, certain sins and come alive to Christ.
That's right. So for us, you can go to yourenneagramcoach.com/origins. That's with an S, origins. And we've got 3 podcasts there that we sat down with 2 other gentlemen and we talked through it.
Pastors.
For they're pastors, theologians, and then there's an article there that's written for it. I was highly influenced by Francis Schaeffer. He was a pastor and professor within our denomination, and so his approach to how to address culture that was not one. Immerse yourself in culture being of the world, and nor was he avoidant of the world where you just retract back to create your own culture. Yeah. It really was a way of being in the world but not of it.
Well, we see Paul doing that as well.
Yeah. That's right. So, yeah, and there we list how the Bible even functions in that way, and the sense that many of the Psalms were rewritten Babylonian hymns that David ascribed to Jesus. So Paul in Athens, those kinds of passages, it's all there on the article. But, for us, it is saddening
and that's why our
to
journey
us.
was so long.
That's right. So we didn't talk about it until...
I would be reading and studying
years.
about myself and really as a 9 trying to understand myself and help our marriage to grow and blossom. And so I'd come across something that I'm like, okay, they use this word and that is not at all how we would theologically approach it.
Right.
I remember essence being a word
essence,
that was used.
And I'm like, hey, Jeff, I get where they're going with that, but because him having 4 years of theological training from a very conservative Christian seminary, I was like, hey, all truth is God's truth. So
there it is.
They're getting at something that's true, but from a theological standpoint, how do we categorize this? How do we view this? What is biblically accurate? And so we did that from the 2001 period until we really started utilizing it in 2008. Now, we kept doing that, but it wasn't until 2008 where I think we felt more comfortable because we had sifted through so much of it.
Right. We were no longer referring to these other authors to be read, but we were creating our own content from a biblical perspective.
Yeah.
And throwing out what we don't agree with.
And the best way that I can describe it to people who may be suspicious or concerned, number one, honor your experience, because Christians are intended to be cautious. I don't want to say cautious, discerning about different teachings. So honor it. This is not something to run away, and we're not trying to convince people to somehow infringe upon their conscience.
This is
anyway.
one tool of thousands.
And so the way that I phrase it is that oftentimes people think of the Enneagram as almost like the Mormon Church, where a person received what they said was divine revelation, and that functioned then as an authority for a community of people who believed in it. That was not what happened with the Enneagram. The Enneagram was a professor who had a faith and began teaching it to students, and those students began teaching it in their own way, but using certain aspects. They would change things, add things,
to the point where,
get rid of things, and say, no, that's not accurate. I think this is more accurate. And so it was more like a professor teaching students a theory that other people built upon.
Right.
And so every teacher is going to teach from their worldview, and so there's nothing to be afraid of. Our presentation of the Enneagram is not to usurp the scriptures or the fruit of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but it's to help us to come in line with it, which there have been all kinds of number of tools that pastors have written over the decades.
Well, and lastly, just on this, and we can move on, is that our mission statement at Your Enneagram Coach actually doesn't even have the word Enneagram in it. Our mission statement is to help people to understand themselves with astonishing clarity so they can break free from self-condemnation, fear, and shame. Wow. By knowing and experiencing the unconditional love, forgiveness, and freedom in Christ. So again, it's taking us from that orphan mindset into who we really are as the beloved child. And we just happen to use the tool of the Enneagram. But again, it's just a tool. And if someone's not comfortable with it, it's perfectly fine. Christ is all we need.
Yeah, that's so good. That's one of the things that drew me to what you guys are doing. I think that's very distinct about what you guys are doing is that you're taking the Enneagram and you're kind of distilling it through the lens of the gospel. And you're saying, okay, well, what's right and good and true and beautiful about this tool as it pertains to the gospel, right? But let's not let the Enneagram inform the gospel. Let's do it the other way around.
Yes.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful thing. My kids go to a classical Christian school, and that's their big thing. Is they're like, hey, we're gonna learn from some of the old classics, right? We're gonna have them read Plato and Aristotle, but we're gonna always get them to think critically about what's right and good and true and beautiful.
Yes. Because
eternity is written on our hearts, and all truth is God's truth. And Paul, like you referenced in Acts 17, was able to utilize the idol to an unknown God to evangelize that and say, well, let me show you what you're sensing here, and you're discovering, but I can now put some truth to that will cause this light bulb, this gospel awakening to come out in you.
Right.
And I think that's what really initially drew me to what you guys are doing. And I was going to ask you in that, can you frame up for us how the Enneagram and the gospel integrate right there? You almost did that essentially, Beth, with your mission statement, right? But is there anything else that you would say right there if you're trying to paint a lens for people and going, well, here's how we see the two?
I think we can do it. I'll have you do it, but I think we can do it really simply with Jeremiah 2:13.
Yeah, there's so many ways. That's right. So in Jeremiah 2, it says that for my people have committed two sins. They've forsaken me, the spring of living water, and dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. The idea, God's saying to his people, you have strived to live a life apart from me. But that what you are putting your energy, resources, identity, value, and worth into is leaking. It can't do what it's. Wow. And so, but I'm inviting you.
The cistern being like a clay jar.
That's right.
It says it's broken.
These cisterns were used for security purposes. So some of them could be small jars, or they could be large water systems under a city if they were under attack to have water. And these were man-made, and they would put water in them. They would crack, and so they wouldn't function the way self-protective way that they were they were hoped or put intent behind. Mm-hmm. But Jesus invites us back as the spring of living water, which is a theme that he picks up on in the Gospels, that he is the spring of living water. And we think about the Samaritan woman. And so when we think about an Enneagram type, number one, it is in line with our understanding of that God makes us uniquely. So he's adopted us in love before the creation of the world. He's knit us together in our mother's womb. He has prepared good works in advance for us to do. He has given us by his Spirit certain gifts that we have a unique contribution to the community. So being unique is not contrary to Scripture. That's actually consistent with the Scriptures. But we have used these gifts, strengths, abilities, talents to make life work apart from the cross. And that's our Enneagram type. But as with the Scriptures, so, I remember before I was a Christian, I was a successful football player in Texas. And before I was a Christian, I used that for my own notoriety and image and acceptance. And matter of fact, I was invited to speak at different places. But then I became a Christian, and that all became, no longer was it about me. I was doing many of the same things, but it was more about Jesus. And that the benefit of the Enneagram is not that one says that you've tried to make a life work apart from Jesus, which is the sin nature, the flesh, the old self. But because of the gospel and because of the Spirit being the new man, the new creation, the new self, that we are becoming something new, and these gifts actually become a contribution to how we live out our calling in relationships and how we live out our calling in careers.
Well, and so just to take that step further from an actual inside Enneagram perspective is that to find your main type, because there's 9 valid perspectives of the world, 9 main types, you find your main type based off of the core motivations, why you do what you do, based off of your core fear, your core desire, your core weakness. Other teachers will call it passion or deadly sin, and then your core longing, the message your heart longs to hear. And especially when you get to the message your heart longs to hear, that's what we're striving for, right? Mm. So either we're going to get that through the spring of living water, or we're going to dig our own cisterns.
That's it.
And so what we're doing is revealing all of that. Like you said, we have to have self-awareness to even know that we're digging these cisterns that are broken, because we feel like, no, this makes sense. Like this is how it's done, or this is how I get, fulfilled. But they're broken. And once we wake up to that fact that it's broken, and oh my goodness, right here, literally next to me is the spring of living water, and I can have as much as my heart desires, and it is glorious and beautiful. Then what's going to happen is Christ fills that core longing. He satisfies it. And so that's where we're trying to take people is we know that you have this core longing and this need, but we need to stop digging and we need to start drinking from Jesus Christ.
Wow. That's so good. That's so good. It lines up. One of the things that I remember thinking when I first heard of the Enneagram, began to study a little bit, is that you see two kind of, well, at least I saw 2 different types of people engage with the Enneagram. They would use the Enneagram as like an excuse for why they are the way they are.
Yeah.
And, it's like an excuse not to grow as which is the absolute antithesis of what the Enneagram is supposed to be. It's a tool for growth. Yeah. It's not supposed to be an excuse, but
the opposite of the gospel.
Yes. It's an explanation for why I am the way I am right now, or where there's some fracturing or brokenness that manifests itself in my particular design. Right. But then it also, the scripture and the gospel gives us a roadmap for how do we then get back to the core identity of a child of God, right? Mm-hmm. And so I wonder, how do we discern those things as we're discovering our type? And I'm making some massive assumptions right now that people understand the types of Enneagram. I'm not going to have you do a flyover of them because we don't have the time to do that. But as they're beginning to understand their type, what informs them like, oh, this explains who I am. This provides a lot of relief to some of the angst I've been feeling around this, but then also this gives me a little bit of a pointer back to how I need to be engaging with the gospel and with God in terms of letting that new man or that new woman begin to surface. Where's the tension between the two?
I will say this, and this is just a side note. So since we had gone through a significant experience with a church in 2015, I've been participating in a 12-step program. And it's interesting. There's an idiom. They say 3 steps and you're out. Because even in recovery, people will want to say, I'm broken and I need help, step 1. And I want to trust God, that I'm willing to trust God, a power outside of myself. And then 3, to work these steps. But when it gets to make a fearless moral inventory, step 4, people opt out. And I think the Enneagram, in some senses, it functions in the same way, is that, well, this explains what problems I have in the world, but I'm not prepared to do anything about it.
Yeah. And I think that's a really valid point, because I think people need to realize is the Enneagram is a non-judgmental friend, and it is going to lay it all out. So now it's laying out all of it. So it's laying out the beautiful, amazing aspects of how we glorify God when we're healthy, but it's going to go all the way to the other side.
Beth, when you asked me before we started recording, you said, what's your Enneagram type? And I was like, oh, I don't want to say.
Exactly.
But I wonder if everybody has that feeling, right? Because we know
everyone does.
The terrible sides.
You're not doing the Enneagram right if you don't have the feeling.
Yeah. Exactly. And
But I was thinking of sword and shield.
Right.
Yeah.
So, well, and I'll let you tackle that. But, what we want people to realize is you're going to have that moment where you start to learn about your type, when you kind of settle on your main type, and you're going to have that feeling of like, ugh. And here's what I want people to recognize is that it's okay. It's actually good because you've been freed. You've been redeemed. You've been restored. God is bringing you to a new understanding that you do operate on this side of heaven, both from that wounded part of your heart or the orphan mindset,
right?
But who you really are in Christ, you are his beloved child. And so no matter where we are in the levels of health, according to our Enneagram type, we are still always seen as righteous because of Christ's righteousness put on us. And so we can, because of that, we can see this spectrum of who we are and accept it, not in the sense of like, oh, yep, that's who I am. I'm just going to be this way, not, and that's what Jeff was saying. We don't want to use it as a sword or as a shield. We don't want to hide behind, well, I'm just a 9, so I'm not going to know myself ever. So too bad, Jeff. Like, we don't want to hide behind it. God calls us to be more like Christ, and that's transformation. That is growth. And it's growth in the way that he designed us. So it's not, I shouldn't be striving to become like Jeff and his Enneagram type.
That's pretty great.
I was actually going to say the opposite. I feel like,
really hard.
9s are the most desirable. To me, it feels like 9's the most desirable, right? It's like, you see everybody's perspective.
Oh, don't, Dave. Are you kidding me? You're encouraging it.
Of course, 9 is where I go when I'm unhealthy. So that's, I don't.
And health.
Or under stress.
It can be health too. So yeah.
Yeah, so under stress you go there, but that's like Enneagram 101 teaching, which is great.
Right.
But you actually, at your very healthiest, you get to the healthiest part of 9. Okay. And you're still 3, and you're using the healthiest part of 6.
And this is what you guys have just written in this book, right? This is essentially the concept.
So we actually, with the Enneagram, this is just a really quick side note. Everyone's going to be like, wait, what? So you have the Enneagram 101 with those arrows, those lines that are connected. You have under stress, which is what you were saying. As a 3, you go to 9. And then when you're growing, you go towards the healthier part of 6.
I go toward
But
so you need to be like me, Davey.
Right.
So I just need to be like right in the middle of you guys and just kind of,
But what we also show, if you take it a step further, when you are mainly at home, or with those that you're closest to, you will go in the direction of the less healthy 6. That's called your blind spot path. And this is where the 3 who shines for everyone else, like, we can do it, let's go, let's achieve. At home, you might complain or anxious or worried, or you're expressing some more of those anxieties, but you're never going to do that like with anyone else.
You are blowing my mind right now, Beth, because I'm literally, oh my gosh. Okay, sorry. I'm gonna suspend my. I'm gonna act like I know exactly what you're talking about for the sake of everybody who's watching this and listening to this. And then,
well, most people don't, and that's and that's okay, because most of the books out there, because it's a lot to absorb the way it's typically taught. So so that's the blind spot path. Okay, so what is your growth path? So those that are Enneagram informed out there, what is your growth path? At home, you're going to typically go in that same direction, but in a less healthy way. Now, our book, More Than Your Number, which we'll get into, covers this. But here's what's really cool is, so you've gone into your growth path. Okay, so for you, you've gone to a healthier part of 6, which really means for you take on courage and resilience,
right? Loyalty
and loyalty, and it's all about
collaboration,
us versus
other
me.
people. Yeah.
And so that's really great. But you'll take that path and take it a step further into the healthiest part of 9. And what we call that the converging path. And that's where you're using your healthy 3, your healthy 6, and now the healthy 9. And what that's going to do for you as a type 3 is not only are you still striving and growing and doing the things that a 3 does in a healthy way, not for your own image, but for the sake of others and for the glory of God. But the 9 is going to allow you to be. Instead of being a human doing, you're a human being, and you're able to incorporate all of this in that same space. And
in our conversation prior to us recording, you had talked about yielding to providence,
right,
and stewarding the story that God has given you. And so, many threes in their fleshly part of their heart will want to force providence. They will want to make something work.
Yeah, achieve it.
And to be successful. They don't want to live in a fallen world where it presses back against you. But on the converging path where a 3 goes to 9, they don't give up. It's not giving up. It's yielding, that I'm not in control of this world. Wow. So I'm going to yield to providence because there's something even better out there that God has in store.
And that's really at the heart of our book, More Than Your Number, is these connecting parts to you.
Connecting types.
Connecting
like the
types.
wings and the arrows.
Yep. Are either going to function for you out of the wounded part of your heart, the less healthy, or they're going to function from the beloved part, the healthier part, the one that knows, believes, and trusts in their identity in Christ. Right. And it's what we're hoping in the book is that you will be able to be more aware and attuned and mindful of your heart condition. Where's my heart right now? Not from a shame perspective, but in a place where you're aware and attuned so that you can coach, lead, pastor, mentor that wounded part of your heart. Welcome it, care for it. It has needs, and mentor it towards the truth into the beloved space.
Well, in the book we talk about David's Psalm, I think it's 42, where he talks about, why so downcast, O my soul? Yeah. What does it look like for us to not shame or ignore these parts of our hearts, but to learn how these parts of us that may be less healthy are carrying a burden, and we get to extend the grace of God to these parts of us.
Yeah, so like for you, let's say you're seeing the patterns because you're like, oh wait, you're blowing my mind, So you're seeing these patterns at home from that less healthy 6 space. And what most of us will do is we'll shame ourselves or guilt ourselves or, whatever it is. And it actually spirals us even further down.
Yeah, for sure.
But the Enneagram, what it's doing is it's just, again, it's a non-judgmental friend. It's just laying it out there. It's just a map of understanding.
It's like a flashlight. It's just lighting the way.
Yeah. And so it's like, oh, hey, this is what's going on. Yeah. I must be anxious inside. There are things going on that I need to be mindful and attuned to. So what can I do to see what's going on with the wounded child, part of my heart? What is it afraid of? What is it, what does it need? And how can I attune to it and bring truth into that space? And so it's an opportunity for deeper growth in our trust in Christ and using the Holy Spirit to enable us to grow. And if we can see it through that lens, we don't need to fear anymore having our sin and weakness and challenges pop up in front of us.
Right.
Now, that's easier said than done.
Of course.
But we can go, this is an opportunity to understand my heart. This is an opportunity because I know that Christ has enabled me to grow, to be more like him. But obviously I'm struggling right now. So what do I need to do to help get my heart in alignment with the gospel? And that sometimes utilizing, other people in the journey, like in Pilgrim's Progress, like Faithful, scripture, prayer, all these different things. But it's the awareness piece that's so important. And if we're afraid of being aware, if we just allow it to swallow us whole in that self-condemnation and shame, we're not going to really get anywhere. But we actually now have a tool that will help us to see things clearly and then choose to follow the Holy Spirit and truth into the light of growth and wholeness.
Wow. I told you guys this was going to be a counseling session for me, right? I feel like what you said with that, Jeff, you were saying this, like, for me personally, trusting providential, going into that like convergent space of a 9, the healthiest 9 for me. The thought I had was, man, you have to. As a 3, there's some resistance that the world kind of brings toward your endeavors that you're like, this is just natural resistance. We got to forge through on this. But then there's some resistance that's like divine resistance. That's like, no, I'm holding this back for a reason and for a season right now. And it's learning to discern those things. I imagine all types have that kind of, needing to discern between some of the different propensities that they carry, right? Mm-hmm. And then, so, I mean, maybe you guys can speak to that, but also I think the other thing too that Beth, you were kind of alluding to was relationships. You're talking about this shield versus a sword. Sometimes we can leverage what we know about other people, particularly in marriage, against them in terms of their type and use it as a sword. Yeah. And
We've never done that.
I know. I mean, I feel like
I'll be honest and vulnerable. I do it more than you do it, and that's true.
Like for sixes, our director of coaches calls it he's a type 6 as well, and we call it our sixiness. But Beth sometimes calls it my sixness,
which sounds like sickness.
I see. No, double entendre both sides. There we go.
Yeah. And so, but I mean, when I say I do it more, I'm not ever literally trying, though it does come out.
It's just so easy to do.
It is easy to do.
Because you have vocabulary to describe what's happening.
Yeah.
Sword that you can wield.
I mean, I don't regularly just say to you, stop being a 9.
No, yeah.
But I may talk about your ambivalence of engaging, avoidance.
Disassociation.
Right. And so I talk about
But it matters on how you do it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed.
Yeah, I've heard you say that a few times in 26 years.
It's like, Beth, you're avoiding. If you do it in a way that doesn't land right.
Why do you have to say it in that tone?
I know.
Then I'm going to avoid way more. 9s are the most stubborn on the Enneagram. So it's like, oh, you think I'm avoiding?
Yeah.
Well, just watch this.
I'm going to be a professional avoider.
The Nothing is Wasted content library of resources and podcast episodes are made possible by our growing community of members. If you would like to be a part of having a global impact and help people partner with God to take back their stories, consider joining Community Plus for just $20 a month. Your membership comes with access to a course called Position for Redemption, masterclasses taught by our certified coaches, bonus podcast episodes, and Q&As with myself and some of our other special guests. You can get more information and sign up at nothingiswasted.com/community. I look forward to connecting with you further within our Community Plus platform.
Well, I mean, without seeming obvious, I mean, how can this tool be used to help us in terms of our relationship? I mean, it's already enough of a task and a feat, it seems like, to understand yourself, not to understand your spouse, to understand other people.
Well, here's the cool thing. So in both our, we put out 11 books. Right. 9 of them are journals, which are great. Spouses, friends, small groups, they can use those together no matter what type they are, because it's a 21-day journey, and every day is on the same topic, but then type specific. So you can go, hey, what'd you learn on day 3? Or, so that's really fun. But the other 2 books, the first one we wrote is Becoming Us. So it's learning how to use the tool, the Enneagram, from a gospel-centered perspective in your marriage, though really anyone can use it for any relationship. You just kind of filter out the word marriage and, there you go. Right. But also our More Than Your Number book, which is really what we're talking about, kind of understanding these parts of us in the healthy to unhealthy way. What's cool about both of those, they're both fantastic for relationship understanding. And in the back of the book, Jeff always says, it's like an album. There's always 2 songs that are the hits in an album that you really just listen to over and over again. Well, the back of the book, it's segmented for each of the 9 types. And there's usually about 6 to 8 pages per type. And so if you go back there, on the Becoming Us, we literally show you what your personality is like, in a lot of bullet forms. So you can it's like a cheat sheet. So if those are you, they're like, I don't really read books. Well, hey, this is just cheat sheets. Just go to the back. You're going to get a lot of great information very quickly. But it also says what the other person is like. So how do you understand them? What are they looking for in relationship with you? How can you love them better? And then in More Than Your Number, we're really showing you how all of these connecting types to your main type are functioning, whether in that wounded space or that beloved space. And so you can quickly see. So if you were to read the book right now and you were to look, oh my gosh, look at, I do go to 6 in these unhealthy ways, and I do go to 9 in these healthy ways. That is a new epiphany for most people that have been into the Enneagram. So if you're out there and you're an Enneagram enthusiast, more than your number takes it to another level.
Oh, that's great.
Just a very practical way of how to do this. John Gottman, in his marriage research, has said that one of the attributes of a master at relationships versus a disaster, that's his words, not mine, master, but he says is that they accept influence from one another. So if you've built trust by a 5-to-1 ratio of affirmation to whether a challenge, a criticism, something feedback, yes. So you'll develop something called positive sentiment override, that you are receptive to someone's feedback, your spouse's feedback.
Interesting.
So the bad way of addressing the character defects of associated with a type is to say, Beth, you are a avoider. You have been an avoider our entire marriage, and I don't think you're ever going to change.
Okay, which behind the scenes is true.
You come from a family of avoiders, and you need to go and get fixed. Yeah. That would be the way that you don't do it.
That'd be a disaster example.
Truth. That is not the way to handle it.
I mean, I don't know how to say this to guys. It comes natural to say it that way, but it doesn't work. And we all know it doesn't work.
Well, it works. It's just not the way you want it to work.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul's words about rules, he says in Colossians that these are destined to perish with use. Like this, that it just never works. But we keep trying. But here's the way of doing it. Hey, Beth, my experience of you today is that I sense that you're starting to step away. And the way that I feel about that is that I feel a little lonely in doing a particular project together or in doing some chores. And I really enjoy doing life together with you. Would you be willing to help me with this project? So I've not
How'd
you
that land,
words.
Beth?
I've just used I words.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and then as the 9 who wants
We
to
just had
do life
like an
with people,
intimate moment right there.
like, let's go. We can do it.
Yeah, I got her out of it. She's out of the slough.
Yeah. No, yeah, and it's different for each couple type combination. We actually developed 45 courses, one for each couple type combination, to show them their dance, the way that they function in unhealth and health, and how to get from one place to the other. And it's really important to understand who you are in relationship with, because what he just said to me landed on my type 9 heart really well, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to land on all the other types' hearts the same way. A type 8 might be like, all he would have to say is, hey, what's going on? You seem distant. I really like us to get these things done together because I really enjoy you. And it's just like straight to the point, blunt, let's go. And so by understanding your type and their type and how the two function together is really important. And again, it's just bringing clarity and understanding.
Yeah.
So the 4 principles behind it are, and this comes from the book odd title, but it's called Nonviolent Communication. It's an older best-selling marriage communication book. But you state what happened. You state your experience of what happened. You state your need or desire, and then you make a request. But it's never about them. You're saying, hey, this is my experience right now. Would you be willing to join me in remedying this? And it's non-confrontational. And so it doesn't put people on the defensive, and you don't start fighting over it, but you actually have the opportunity to use conflict as a way of connecting.
And that's what's so cool about the Enneagram. So like what he just said, I can take that information and filter it through the 9 types.
That's right.
Yeah.
You know, because that truth, that piece of information needs to be slightly tweaked to I guess, be utilized at its best for each of the 9 types.
Yeah.
And for it to land on each of the 9 types in a way that brings out the best in them as well.
Wow. Do you guys find that there's any particular types that have a natural discord versus a natural resonance? Or, I mean, I know there's so many variables involved.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, it's really interesting. We know a few, because we have a course for each couple type, and if you go to becomingus.com, there's a personalized marriage plan. You just put in both of your types, and we'll give you 6-page summary over that relationship
For free.
Wow.
for free. So there certainly are
right after
trends.
this conversation, by the way.
There certainly are trends.
And you don't have to marry. It talks about being married, but like you could just do like you and a child, you and a coworker.
That's great.
But there are trends in what types couple up. So there are very few 5 and 5 relationships. We do know a few 8 and 8 relationships, and it's
What you think?
energetic.
Intense.
Such a great way of putting that, Jeff.
A lot of passion. The spoon drops on the floor, and you're like, okay,
Boom.
are we going to put the gloves on, or
Yeah.
are we just going to move on? And yet at the same time, when it's almost like Ghostbusters putting their, when they say don't cross the,
Oh, yeah.
when they cross them, they take on, like 8s can take on marshmallow monsters.
But then we know a couple type that's a 9 and a 9, and it's the complete opposite.
Complete opposite.
But that doesn't mean, because the 9s aren't less intense, doesn't mean that they're healthier. And that's the key here is, when we say this all the time, and it's not a cop-out, it's absolutely true, is there are 45 couple types, and God brings us together with these, with one another. Again, whether it's your spouse or your children, your coworkers, church, whatever it is, God brings us together into community. What matters is how healthy or unhealthy we are. And that's where our book, More Than Your Number, really can be helpful, because it's letting you know, am I operating from a less healthy, wounded part of my heart and all the defensive strategies that come with that? Or am I leaning into using truth and the Holy Spirit to help me to live out of my beloved part, which is the healthy part of my heart? And when that's operating, the overflow, as we know, the overflow of our heart is really beautiful. And so that's the key. So when you have 2 8s together, when their hearts are aligned with the truth of the gospel, man, it is powerful. It's dynamic. It's rich. They are plowing a path for so many people. But then when they get to unhealthy, it's going to be explosive and really hard. But it's the same with any 2 types. You get a 5 and a 2 together. They're very opposites, but we actually find that couple type combination together a lot.
And one of the statements that we use is that what first attracts you will eventually frustrate you.
Yeah.
So, but Beth, being a 9, attracted me. She's steady. She has
Calm.
Yeah, that's right. There's warmth. There's presence.
She's amazing.
Yes. It's like, wow, she's going to keep going. And at the same time, there's another side to being present, is that sometimes she loses her sense of identity to be present to me.
Well, we talk about Jeff, when we met, being like a Ford pickup truck on the highway going 100 miles an hour. And I'm this little Fiat on the service road next to it going 30. I'm on a Sunday drive.
Yeah.
And like he pulled me onto the highway. Now there's a part of that that's really good for me. Like, hey, let's get going. Not being apathetic and disengaged with life.
And you can put a roof rack on that Fiat and carry a little bit more.
And so there's a part of that gets me engaged. And so I might go from 30 to, let's say, 50. And I'm like, whoa, this is really fast. And part of that is I'm pulling him back, hopefully, so that he's maybe going 75, 80, right?
There. Yeah.
But sometimes I will dig in my heels and I'm pulling him back into, like, no, we are going 50. You are not, I am, not going to have you go any faster.
Yeah.
And that's where the unhealth comes in. It's those strategies, thinking, and it's the digging the cisterns. No, as a 9, I must have peace at all cost, and you will be with me on this service road going 30 miles an hour, and I can do that by being stubborn, disengaged, apathetic. There's lots of different ways that a 9 does that. Or I can say, hey, I want to join this journey with you, but I really am not comfortable going 80 or 100. Like, that is just not the pace that God has me in. So we've got to meet somewhere in the middle. And so if I'm going 50 and he's going 80, we're still not, eye to eye,
right?
But we're definitely in the same zone. But it's still true to who we are.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm curious about, we've got so many people who are listening to this, they're undergoing some kind of a trauma, loss, tragedy, grief. I know you said earlier that you guys are doing quite a bit of work on the Enneagram and grief, and you're kind of digging into some of that stuff for the future. But it seems to me too that this more than your number, that also can help to inform, how we process through trauma. One of the things we talk about quite a bit is that, back to the kind of C.S. Lewis quote where pain becomes a megaphone that awakens us, right?
Yeah.
Often it's that those instances of pain and trauma, loss, that we finally stop. And if we're walking through that in a healthy way, we become more aware of who God is, of who we are in light of who God is, and how this world operates, right? It re-clarifies those things for us if we're aware enough to do that. And the Enneagram is such a powerful tool to do that. I'm curious if you guys maybe even give us a flyover of some of the types or all 9 types and how they tend to respond to trauma, stress, pressure. I guess we can kind of categorize it however we want to, or use whatever label we want.
Yeah.
But
I'll just speak to a couple of principles about trauma and loss, and then once you can use example of each type. The first thing that happens when we experience living in a fallen and sinful world is you think of the Psalms, there's disorientation.
Yeah.
And the way that Allender describes it, Dan Allender, is fragmentation.
Yeah.
And so we will seek, with the gifts that we have, the natural abilities, to cope with that. And that can be with or without, or with recognition of who Christ is or without who Christ is.
Yeah, right.
Now, the reality is that we are still in relationship with him. But in that disorientation, we become confused and we double down on our natural efforts to cope, to survive.
Yeah.
And then secondly, we'll move to something of structure or dogmatism. I don't want this to ever happen again. And so we might use spirituality to organize ourselves. We may commit ourselves to a set of rules and expectations, or self-made rules to live by, in order to feel security so that we don't have to experience it again. When you start to do grief work, what you come to recognize is that, wow, okay, what I experienced in being disoriented was actually a gift God has given me to understand who he is and who I am.
That's right.
It gives me opportunity to honor what was lost, and that the path towards healing is not to create a world apart from Christ, but it's actually to re-engage in a new way with a new understanding of who I am and who he is. So for each Enneagram type as it relates to trauma and loss, essentially what it does is that it activates, or the popular term is triggers, the relational strategies that we've always used since childhood.
Yeah, right.
And we just reenact those same things to cope with our pain. Yeah. But why don't you talk about just a few types?
Well,
about
I'm chuckling, Jeff, because we always say don't villainize the trigger. Because often you can encounter a trigger, but that if you view it through the lens of the gospel, that's actually an invitation. God is bringing an experience, a relationship, a moment as an invitation to invite you into deeper healing, deeper self-work, deeper understanding of who he is, right? And a reorientation of how the world operates. Yeah.
If he didn't honor how he was activated as a person.
Yes. Yes.
So even in his anger, his shame, his fear, his confusion, all became an opportunity for him. Now, please understand that that's David writing songs. And I don't know how many people write songs and poems, but you don't just do that instantaneously. Those took time. But he wrote and reflected on his experience of moving. And I think it's Walter Brueggemann on his commentary on the Psalms talks about being disoriented and reoriented as you walk through each of the Psalms.
So good. Beth, you were going to say something. Sorry, I interrupted you there.
No, I was just going along with what you guys said. But yeah, I'd be happy to kind of walk real quickly through, we call it the wheel. It's kind of going around the symbol. And obviously there's so much more to what we're going to say here. This is like
I almost hesitate to ask the question because I'm like, this is almost a exercise of futility because there's so much more to this. But
why don't you take just one of each triad?
I mean, I can do it quickly.
Okay,
so the type 1s are the principled reformers. And when they're struggling with grief and trauma of some kind, it's going to really activate their core weakness, which is resentment, because they think things need to be perfect. Okay, they have an inner critic that's constantly berating them. And so they're going to get more critical and judgmental. But what we need to recognize is that Christ has already fulfilled their core longing of you are good. Not because they are good, but because he is good and his righteousness is on them. Wow. The type 2 is the nurturing supporter. And they are looking for others to appreciate them, that they're needed and wanted. But when there's certain kind of trauma going on or a negative outcome, they might feel rejected. And that's a huge thing for them. So if they feel rejected in any way, they're going to double down with pride. That's their core weakness. And this pride inserts themselves confidently in other people's lives with advice and help and nurture of some kind.
They become more helpful.
Yeah, whether it's wanted or not.
To avoid
overbearing.
The grief.
It's like the smother rather than just the mother, right? Yeah,
exactly. And but what Christ has done is that he has come and said to them, you are loved and wanted just for who you are, not because of what you do, but for who you are. Now, the type 3, you're in your neck of the woods, the admirable achiever. They are wanting to be admired and have high status and to be respected and valued. But if they have any sort of exposure of being a failure or incompetent or inefficient, then what you're going to see is their core weakness of deceit pop up. And this is where they deceive themselves into others into believing that they're something they're not, so something grand. And they may not even realize that is happening. But what Christ has satisfied, he knows the longing of the 3. And so Christ says, I see you for who you really are, your authentic self, and you are loved for simply being you. It's not about your achievements.
As I hear you talking, Bethy, there is a way in which each type can overfunction and underfunction. I'm thinking of the type 1 who might move into the situation to try to make things right for everybody, and but then they can shut down. The 2 can do the same thing, where they become more selfish, self-interest, and demanding of other people to serve them, and they become over-functioning by serving others. And the 3, there may be a part of them that shows up like, I'm handling this, I'm working through it, I'm going to get through this. And then there's another part of them when they're alone where they're very scared and very disorganized.
The type 4 is the introspective individualist. And for them, they are wanting to be unique, special, and different because they really feel at the core that there's something flawed and missing inside them. And so they are longing to belong. And so for the type 4, what Christ does is he satisfies their core longing because he says, I see you and I know you better than you know yourself. And I love you because you're unique and you're special. Now, the type 5 is the analytical investigator, and they are really concerned about feeling depleted of their inner resources and energy, but also not being competent or knowledgeable. And so they're striving to push either people away or make sure no one drains them, but also that they have enough information to be competent. But what happens is they can get very isolated and withdrawn in that space. But what Christ does is he comes in and he says, your needs are not a problem. And that's what's so cool is he's the God of the universe. He has no problem taking care of all their needs and replenishing them, especially, the spring of living water. Come to him and he'll restore you.
Yeah, I mean, again, for a type 5, they could look very, they could isolate or become frenetically active.
Yeah.
Whenever they're grieving.
That's right. So the type 6, your neck of the woods, Jeff, the faithful guardian. So for them, their grief is going to be really, and their trauma is going to be really wrapped up about security, loneliness, connection. Do they have what they need? And are they prepared for what could be around the corner?
Right.
And so what you'll find with them is they will be very anxious. Now, we all can be anxious, but they can be very anxious in the mind of an internal committee. So they have this internal committee that's chiming in from all different directions. What did you think about this? Did you think about that? Are you prepared here? Are you prepared there? And then it creates a lot of self-doubt. And so they're looking outside themselves for support. And so they can trust too much people, beliefs, and things outside themselves versus trusting what the Holy Spirit is doing inside them. But Christ comes and says, you are safe and secure with me. Follow me.
I remember whenever my mom died in 2000, we were on a church trip in New York. We flew down, and within hours of us getting to the hospital, she ended up dying. But I remember my heart moving to responsibility for the family
That's
quickly.
Right. Yep.
And because I didn't want to admit to having lost someone of significance to me. So my responsibility was a way of inhibiting grief.
That's good.
Wow.
Yeah. So then the type 7 is the enthusiastic optimist. And they really struggle with being trapped in emotional pain. And so you can imagine, for someone that's dealing with grief and trauma, this is going to be a really, really hard space. So what you usually find with the type 7 is they're bouncing to the next positive thing, to the next experience, the next stimulation. And it's really hard for them to sit in that moment. But what Christ does is he lets them know, I will take care of you. At the core, at this lonely place, at this place of grief. But I need you to sit here with me and to savor the moment. And that is just really hard and really scary for the sevens.
Like a great example is the movie Patch Adams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was with Robin Williams.
Yeah, if you haven't seen that, it's a fantastic,
that is a 7
hard
walking
movie,
among
but
pain
it's fantastic
in both healthy and unhealthy ways.
Yeah, based on a true story.
Yep.
And then the type 8 is a passionate protector. Now, they really are concerned about being controlled, harmed, manipulated, controlled, and grief is going to take control of your heart. And they're going to do everything possible to use their intensity and their drive to push through it and to maybe ignore it, like get through it. Like, I'll just work harder. I'll just move mountains somehow. But as we all know, grief catches up. And so what Christ wants them to know is that you are protected and taken care of by me. And so that they can come to him, like chicks with a hen, like, come, I've got you, or the cleft, the rock. And so that's really important for the 8s. Do you have anything on the 8?
I mean, I have a lot of things.
Again, back to the point that there is much.
8s become the fighters, and they want to fight for the injustice. They want to push back on the fall. So
they might not rest in the horrible
tragedy. To feel controlled by the tragedy? No.
But the sovereignty.
But if they grieve well, they come out as these gentle warriors.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
And then the type 9, we just absolutely fear being disconnected, some sort of conflict, not having harmony and peace and stability. And that is pretty much the definition of trauma and grief, right? Like, you have lost something. And usually what it feels like for the 9 is you've lost a part of yourself because we merge with others. And so not only are we grieving the loss of that individual, or we've lost the relationship if it's a trauma, but we really feel like we've lost a part of ourselves. And how do we reconcile that, especially when we don't know ourselves well? And And so what you'll find with the 9s is we'll get very withdrawn, we'll cut ourselves off, we'll become apathetic, maybe withdrawn and still. But what Christ wants us to know is that our presence matters in life, even in the process of grief, even in the hard spaces, and that we need to engage in those spaces for our own well-being and growth and growing through the grief, but also for everyone else as well. They need that perspective from the 9 as they all grieve as well.
I remember when that experience with my mom in 2000 that anger came up for you.
Yeah. I was pregnant with Libby.
That's right.
And I was angry at sin and death.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like, you took her from my daughter, and I knew that your mom would have doted on Libby.
That's right.
And I was angry. And I remember, because, a lot of, Christians are like, oh, but she's in a better place. And I was
they
like,
spiritually bypass grief.
Yeah. And I was like, no, I am angry at sin and death. It robbed us of something special. And I remember, because that's when you were in seminary and you're like, no, that is a good space to be in, Beth. And so I allowed it to be what it was.
Yep. That's so good.
So there you go. The 9 types.
That's amazing.
And there's obviously so much more to unpack. There's things of understanding of like, okay, so then when we're in that space and we're struggling, what are the defensive mechanisms that come up for us? And how can we recognize those, again, not with shame and guilt, but how can we recognize those to bring them to the foot of the cross and allow Him to shape and mold us into a healthier response in that grief and trauma.
That's so
and
good.
You've said it a lot, Davey, that don't waste your pain. This is an opportunity.
Yeah.
Even whenever you find yourself in an unhealthy mindset and relational habit, this is an invitation to see, Jesus is not anxious, disrupted, concerned, disappointed with you. He fully understands who you are.
That's right.
You're the one who's coming into understanding of where you're at.
So good.
But this is an invitation to engage with your Father.
Yeah.
This is not a disqualification of relationship with Him.
Yeah. I just finished reading Athanasius on the Incarnation, and which is early church father, right? I mean, like, long, very ancient book. But the idea behind it really, I mean, the whole theme was the necessity of God becoming man. Why did that have to take place? So that we have a high priest that can fully empathize with us. And I think practically what that informs us, even as we're talking right now, I'm thinking about this, that no matter if nobody else understands you to the full, no matter if you don't even understand yourself, right? This is a journey where we can continue to keep understanding who we are. He understands.
Yeah.
And He knows you. And that's the basis for why our identity has to be rooted in Him.
Yep.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Right.
Oh, it makes me think of, and we speak about this in More Than Your Number, but I think it's Mark 8, where a man has a child who was demon possessed and throws himself in the fire, and he comes in encounter with Jesus, wanting him to heal his son, and Jesus says, I can do all things, but do you believe? And he says, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. And the fact that this man could come with such ambivalence and Jesus respond to him with kindness and compassion and mercy. I mean, the Bible, the Gospels themselves should demonstrate to us Jesus wants to be known as a person who is with sufferers.
Yeah.
And so whenever we are suffering, and whatever that means for us, He wants to be present with us.
When He's close. Yeah.
That's so good. Guys, you guys, man, this has been unbelievable. You've been so gracious, too, with your time and with your wisdom. And my goodness. Okay. The most recent book, you've got so many out there, but the most recent one, More Than Your Number. How can we get connected with you guys? How can we get connected with that book? Give us, I know you've got stuff that is readily and available for people to connect with you. What's the best way?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the landing page for our book is called Your Enneagram Profile.com, where that's going to come with all kinds of bonuses for the book that'll help you to implement this new paradigm of how to approach the Enneagram that's a little bit different than what typical Enneagram content is. And the real goal is that we recognize after the popularity of the Enneagram kind of peaked, is that the Enneagram became much more about descriptions and information and less about transformation.
Yeah.
And knowledge doesn't change us.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, that was a phrase that I learned in recovery, is that discovery is not recovery.
Yeah, that's good.
Just because you have a label for it doesn't mean that anything changes.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to look at the Enneagram through something that we've been using through our own therapy. This came out of our own story and church hurt that happened in 2015, is what do I do? Like, why is there two parts of me where I feel like a healthier self, a fuller self, and a more younger, fearful, ashamed self, the beloved and wounded?
Yeah, right.
Well, how does that impact both of my wings? So we do operate out of both, and both of my paths, these other connecting types. And to where, like for a type 6, I see my 9-ness. I call my 9-part Phil. I give names to these parts, and it helps us to identify.
Well, there's
what's
actually
going on.
trauma therapy that does that as well. So
Yeah.
that's
Well,
really good.
That's right.
It was
so you're picking up
inspired.
on. You've heard of internal family systems.
Right.
What we've done is that we've applied internal family systems
Somewhat.
for the Enneagram. We've
Wow.
changed a little bit of it, but then applied the gospel to it.
Which really
So-
makes the Enneagram so much
it's rich.
easier to use.
My gosh.
So it,
So
it
much
clarifies, it simplifies the Enneagram, and it's actionable. It's
Yeah.
no longer just descriptions of a type, but okay, whenever I notice that Phil, this 9 part of my heart wants to shut everything down, all the anxiety, all the thinking, the committee that's in my head, the fears, the tightness in my chest and my gut, that wants to shut it all down. That's Phil. But Phil is also the part of me that stays calm and has emotional balance and warmth and presence as a leader. So this part of me functions in healthy and unhealthy ways. And we offer, the tool that we use is called Aware, and it's just a spiritual practice that can be practiced in the moment. It could be a regular spiritual practice in the morning of identifying what's happening inside my interior world, and then how do I apply the gospel to this part of me.
I can't wait to pick this up. I'm going right now to order it, honestly. And I never say that on a podcast episode. So you guys, that's
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
you'll
well,
love it
I'm
if you're-
serious. No, I'm like, man, this.
Well, because our conversation, even before we hit record, you've already been doing this work. You just didn't have the vocabulary and so you're going to be able to like really utilize the Enneagram now on a deeper, richer level.
That's right.
But it's really helped us. I mean, that's why we wrote it, because we've been using it for ourselves.
Once again, it's the overflow of our own experience and our own therapeutic work.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
guys, thank you so much. We're going to put all the links right there on the show notes. You guys, if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or some other medium, you can access it right there. We'll put it right there on our podcast page if you're watching this on YouTube. But man, Jeff and Beth, you guys, listen, I was excited about this and you didn't disappoint. Thank you so much.
That's
Well,
awesome.
we are so
Thank
delighted
you.
to be here. Thanks for the work you're doing. Man, you've inspired me just on a whole new level of thinking through the Enneagram and grief and trauma, and like it's such a needed work. So
It is.
thank you.
It is. Well, let's have more conversations. I'd love to have you
Let's
guys
do.
back on and let's talk some more about this as we're
That'd be
helping
great.
others. All right. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.